Good morning, folks, and welcome. My name is Phil. I'm a site historian here at Edison Ford. It's my pleasure to talk to you for about the next 15 minutes or so about how Thomas Edison perfected the incandescent light bulb when he was only 32 years old. This happened back in 1879. Now, I hold in my hand here one of history's modern marvels. In its day, a device which the common knowledge of science was impossible to create. The concept of electric lighting through incandescent bulbs was as foreign as putting a man on the moon was when we were children, way back when. Common knowledge was that it just could not be done. Edison, being the kind of man that he was, he never gave up on anything. And so in his 20s to 30-year-old time frame in his life, he would be a aficionado, if you would, of the work of a fellow by the name of Michael Faraday, a British physicist who understood the relationship between magnets and conductors. And Edison would study these early works of Michael Faraday, and he would come up with a system that not only allowed electricity to be generated, but also distributed into the end users' homes or businesses, and provide electricity to put a light bulb to work in your house. An incredible concept for the day because, as I mentioned, everybody knew it couldn't be done, right? But he never gave up on it. So we'll begin our discussion today with a quiz. Don't worry, I'll help you with the answers, okay? How many of you last night, when you found it necessary to put a light on, you flipped the switch and the light came on? How many of you made the amazing revelation that it was an incredible adaptation of Faraday's law of electromagnetic induction applied to an incandescent material with an evacuated glass cylinder and distributed through a 230-volt system throughout the United States of America? How many of you? Oh, I knew you would back there, sir. I could tell. Yeah, and some other folks right here, right. Some of us know where electricity comes from. Many of us do not, unfortunately. But when you leave here in about the next 15 minutes, you'll have a better idea of how all this came together, if a somewhat simplified format, but we're going to talk about that today. So the electric light bulb, as you see it right here, was the work of many, many different people. If you were to Google who invented the electric light, you would find the response so long you wouldn't have time to read it. But the difference between those who studied the light and those who eventually perfected it was significant. The material that Edison used to perfect his light bulb would separate him from all the others in this great mix of scientists studying the light bulb. The fly in the ointment, as we say. Why wouldn't the bulb work? How come they just burned up? What was wrong with the other materials that were used? These were all the thoughts that Edison studied as he was trying to come up with an incandescent bulb. And he would study many, many different types of materials, trying to find a filament. Now, the filament, you can barely see it in this, but it is those very fine strands, and you can see them in an incandescent bulb at home. That's the filament. That filament material was the problem because none of them would seem to last when the electricity was applied to the device. It would simply burst into flames, or they might glow a little bit. They wouldn't produce the right amount of luminosity, or they wouldn't work at all. So it was necessary for Edison to look for many different types of materials that could meet his need for longevity. And he experimented with plant materials. Some of these are actually quite comical. Human hair, fuzz, lint, cardboard, Bristol as they called it, carbonized paper, any type of a material that would give him sufficient resistance to cause incandescence, meaning the material would glow rather than burn. And so plant material, he settled on plant material for a while and found that a bamboo filament, curly-Q part in here that glows, made of bamboo, would provide sufficient resistance. It would glow, literally glow in the dark, and it wouldn't burn out. Now, he was able to improve on this bamboo fiber through carbonization, meaning he burned it, fancy word, he blackened it, and that initial bamboo filament would burn for 1,200 hours. he knew that he was onto something with this device. Now, the second thing that he did that others had not done was he figured out that, why do things burn? Well, they have air supporting combustion, right? You know, if you remove the air from something, it won't burn. He said, I wonder if I could draw a vacuum, in other words, remove the air from the inside of this little bulb to the point where the filament would last longer. And that's what he did. He invented a vacuum process where he could suck the air out of the glass bulb. He could use his bamboo filament, carbonized filament, and he put that to work, and lo and behold, he has perfected the incandescent bulb in 1879 at the age of 32. Now, this is a classic example of putting the cart before the horse. What do I mean by that? He's come up with a bulb, but he doesn't have any way of delivering electricity to the customer base. He's got a problem, doesn't he? Yeah, how do you do that? Well, he decides, I obviously have to build an electrical generating system. I have to figure out how to deliver it to the customer's house. I have to find a way to make it safe. I've got to come up with ways so I don't provide overcurrent to a device that might catch on fire. Gee, I've got a whole bunch of wiring that I have to put into use here. How am I going to do all this? So he goes to work in his laboratory. And again, he goes back to the early days of Michael Faraday, the British physicist, who first studied the relationship of conductors and magnetic fields. Now, if you don't know how electricity is generated, I'll very simply tell you today that electricity is mechanically generated, and there's various ways of doing this, chemically and through solar. But mechanical generation involves one premise that goes back to the early 1800s of Michael Faraday. He discovered that if a conductor, meaning a wire, and a magnetic field, you know what a magnet is? I got one right here in my shirt. If a conductor is moved through a magnetic field, electricity will be generated. You have to accept that on faith if you can't understand the concept of a magnetic field and a conductor. So let's assume that we all agree that a conductor and a magnetic field will produce electricity if they are in relative motion to each other. This is what Edison did. So how does he do this? How does he put this into practical effect? He's going to develop a generator, and as you've looked around here, you may have looked at these. They're called also dynamos. Direct current generators are known as dynamos. He's going to produce a magnetic field, and he's going to produce a wire, a bunch of wires actually, that can be rotated through the field. If you look at this big one right here, a 30 kilowatt direct current generator, this came from an oil refinery up in Philadelphia many years ago. It was actually used there as a lighting generator. Well, you look at that and you say, I don't see a magnet and I don't see a wire. Well, let me explain to you how this works. Here's your magnet right here. These two big iron cores are electromagnets. They are basically just like a big kettle, if you will, and they're wrapped, as you can see, with wiring. These are wires that are just wrapped in a continuous loop around these two big cores. They're provided with a little electrical charge that turns it into an electromagnet. Unlike this one right here, which is a permanent magnet, this is electromagnet, meaning it has an outside excitation force, as we call it. So this produces a magnetic field right here. This is my two magnets. I have two poles on this magnet. Two magnets right here. If you could look in there, and if we could see a magnetic force, it's kind of like Star Trek, isn't it, in modern time, you would see a line of force going back and forth between these two magnets. There's your magnet. Where's the wire? I don't see a wire. What you do see, actually, is this shaft right here, and on it you'll see this red thing that's in the middle. That's the wire. Actually, many, many, many wires. They're connected to copper segments, and this is what rotates within the magnetic field. So how do I make it move? How do I rotate this? Well, if you look at this little one over here, 3 kW generator, you can see that you can move this shaft through an outside source that turns the shaft. So I got two of Mr. Faraday's things right here. I've got a wire, I've got a magnet. The third thing I need is a motion to make that shaft turn. Now I'm generating electricity. If I could actually get this thing going fast enough, I could probably shock us all a little bit right here in this room. Okay, so he's got the concept of a generator. Magnets, conductors, he's got wiring, He needs a customer base. He picks this little spot right here. If you've ever visited Manhattan, you would recognize in a historical photo Broadway looking up Manhattan. Behind us would be State Street, the old Custom House, Battery Park, Staten Island Ferry. This is Broadway as it looked sometime in the mid-1880s. This was the area that Edison picked to build his first electrical generating station. Why he picked this area? It's fairly obvious. As you can see, it's congested, isn't it? There's a lot of businesses there. There's lots of people. Well, what he wants is a customer base that can be located near his power plant. So he builds his first power plant on a street called Pearl Street. Pearl Street is still there today, just as this street, Broadway, is still there today. It'll be over here, actually, on the Lower East Side, right near the Hudson, the East River. And so he builds his power plant. He realizes through study and through some capital banking that he needs to get to a customer base of about 300 people to make this profitable. So he does, and he finds it in this area. These people are really ready to sign on to this modern marvel of the electric light. Think of what they were using in the meantime. You might have a gas jet on the wall. Every night when it got dark, you'd have to get the matches and turn the gas on and stand back and light it. Or you might have an oil lantern, or you might have a candelabra in your elegant dining room. Well, all of these things were old-fashioned. Edison's going to fix this. He's going to introduce the world to electricity. So all of this was a good customer base. He would build a bunch of dynamos that he called his jumbos. By standards of these little demos right here, they were gigantic. He would power his plant with coal. He had boilers in the basement. These boilers were made by the Babcock-Wilcox Company, still in business today. And these boilers would feed a reciprocating steam engine. They would generate steam. The steam reciprocating engines would be hooked up to the shafts of the generators so that they could turn, so that the conductors and the magnetic fields could interact. In the afternoon of September 3rd, 1882, Mr. Edison is in one of the offices of his main customers here in Lower Manhattan. He gets the word over to the power plant that it's time to put this to use. On that afternoon, Lower Manhattan literally stopped in its tracks. Now, was anybody from New York City today visiting with us? No? I lived in this area for 6 years, and I can tell you that, with all due respect to our friends from New York, they're not impressed by too much, and that's because the city itself is so fascinating every minute of the day that it takes a lot to get them interested. Well, I can tell you on that afternoon, as dusk settled into this area, they were impressed. They literally stopped in their tracks, history tells us, and they wondered what they'd just seen. All of a sudden, lights were coming on in these buildings. It was a glow. It wasn't a harsh glare from a gas jet. It wasn't some type of a system where people had to gradually go around and light a match. It was all of a sudden, this little bulb that I showed you was transitioning the way we live, and it literally changed the way we live through that introduction of the light bulb. How was that? Well, think of it. We were able to work 24 hours a day in an illuminated factory. We were able to go to school at night. We were able to comfortably enjoy reading in our homes. We were able to prevent fire. We no longer consumed the oxygen in our house through a gas jet that was burning on the wall. We had the convenience of flipping a switch to make light come on. All of this because Edison never gave up on his concept. Now, let me back up to the generator one more time, because that Pearl Street station was quite a success. It lasted for several years, and ultimately it burned down. Unfortunately, it had a fire. But that little generating station there would become the Consolidated Edison Companies, which have lasted into modern time. So let me leave you with this quick demo here on how the generation works in a very small scale. Now, if you can imagine this dynamo shrunk down to this right here, you can leave here with the idea of how electricity is generated. I talked about a magnet, I talked about a wire, I talked about relative motion. I have a magnet, I have a wire, and here's my relative motion. This is going to turn the shaft on that generator, and you will see I am generating about 6 volts of electricity to power this little teeny flashlight bulb. The same concept for this applies to this. The same concept that applies to this applies to the most modern nuclear power plant you can find. Faraday's law of EMF, electromagnetic force, is still as much in effect today as it was when he came up with the idea in the early 18 teens. So what does this tell us? It tells us the electrical industry's evolved over the years, but the science that produced it has not changed at all. And how people like Thomas Edison have been able to put that to use, have been able to adapt, have been able to produce things that we use in modern time without a whole lot of change. So, what else do we know about it? Tonight when you flip that light switch on, think about where that electricity comes from. Think about how fortunate we are in this country to have a constant source of electricity, but also in the back of your head, keep in mind how fragile that system can be. And as we look at renewables, we look at alternative sources of electricity in our modern lives, think about how that may change in the future as we go to sources that are renewable, perhaps even returning more to nuclear and other methods, hydropower. They're all out there, the sun. You know, we have methods of doing this in modern time. But it all goes back to this: a wire, a conductor, and relative motion. Electrifying, isn't it? Thank you for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed this.